my god.
The
Oh
final
my god,
moment
he was
realized
running at me.
he was running.
Oh god, that's like a Phasmo jump scare. Hello and welcome to the Warframe tier list. Today we'll be going over Zephyr, and first things first, let's go into the build. So with Zephyr I have two builds, but the first one is a very standardized Zephyr build, making use of her fourth ability Tornado, and her second ability Airburst rounds to group enemies into the Tornado. That paired with an energy sustain helmet ability such as Nourish or Spectrage, which is the old Zephyr build, but now with Nourish, even with only 55% strength, you still get a 55% energy multiplier for all of your energy sustain. I'm using Combat Discipline to drain my health to proc Arcane Avenger for 45% flat crit chance, as shooting into Zephyr's Tornado gives you a final 2x crit damage multiplier, making crit mods, especially flat crit mods for certain weapons like the Nucor, incredibly potent. I'm using Archon Stretch for even more energy sustain, and also I believe that Electricity is by far Zephyr's best elemental type to use in conjunction with Tornado, and the reason for this is because you're grouping all the enemies together and then hitting each of them individually with electricity procs, making each of them arc their electricity procs to each other in a tight clump, instantly nuking all of them, and again, it gives you extra sustain. Archon Vitality is, contrary to popular belief, not actually that good on Zephyr, as it doesn't actually double the heat procs that you're dealing with your weapons, it only doubles the heat procs that you're dealing from the Tornado itself. That is a very distinct difference, and it ends up making Archon Vitality pretty much useless, and it really does nothing. Anchored Glide is a hater passive. If you don't mind her passive, you can just put whatever you want here. Cunning Drift as I'm using Unaro, otherwise Prime Sure-Footed, and Airburst rounds for some extra secondary damage, as Galvanized, Shot, and Conditioned Overload-esque mods do not work whenever you shoot her tornadoes, so Airburst rounds gives you 500% more damage for your secondary, which is very, very useful. As for the second build, it is a first ability centric build using target fixation. This is kind of a meme build, however, it theoretically has infinite damage scaling, and even if you're not doing super endless runs, it still works well. And very little setup, you can make this ability one-shot even level 195 Gokstat officers after you clear them for the first time. Again, this is kind of a meme build, but it definitely works. Now, as for the weapon loadouts I use, I really like the Kuva Chalker as a raw electric weapon on Zephyr, using a build similar to this with a Riven for multi-shot and crit damage, though you can just replace this with something like Bladed Rounds for even more crit damage. Raw Electricity, again, Hammer Shot here for more crit damage and status chance to help you proc electricity. Keep in mind you'll also have Viral thanks to Nourish, and a low strength Nourish is actually beneficial in this case, as it means that most of your procs will still be electricity rather than viral. Other primaries that work well on Zephyr are a Phantasma, specifically an electric Phantasma, or even something like the old Amprex works very well on Zephyr. The Amprex is actually particularly really good on Zephyr because it has really low base damage, and your tornadoes only have 500,000 health, so the Amprex dealing less damage to the tornadoes themselves is actually a blessing in disguise. Again, remember Galvanized Aptitude doesn't actually work when you shoot the tornadoes, so I don't really know the optimal build specifically on the Amprex or the Phantasma, but for the Chalker, that is what I was using. As for the secondary, I'm using a Nucor, and I'm using a raw electricity Nucor. Thanks to Airburst rounds, I'm getting 500% damage, so I get to drop secondary Merciless, which is what you have to use on an electric build as you won't be able to proc Flare. And Merciless only gives 30% reload speed and 360% damage. That sounds good, but Airburst rounds is already giving you 500% damage, so instead you can use Conjunction Voltage to get 120% multi-shot and 60% reload speed, which is infinitely times better, especially since multi-shot double dips on beam weapons. This was the build I was using, and with a build like this, you can one-shot a group of 195 Gokstat officers with a single bullet on the Nucor. It is absolutely insane. As for the melees, I was using a Praetos for the parkour velocity and sprint speed, though other things that work well are the Zals with Exodia Contagion, just a raw damage Zal build shooting into the tornadoes is enough to scale for like an hour or two into missions, and it is a good change of pace. Again, with Zephyr, there's a lot of build variety. You can really run a lot of different weapons, so if you don't like anything I'm showing, just do a bunch of testing with weapons you like, and I'm sure you'll find something that works for you. Another thing that I found to work decently well was a corufell with this build. This build is definitely not optimal, it is just what I threw together with a zero forma build, and even something like this, for a heavy attack build, works very well on Zephyr. It 2-shots 195 Gokstat officers. As for focus schools, I was using Unero for access to prime sure-footed to free up a slot, for access to 15% more ability range thanks to Cunning Drift, and of course Caustic Strike to give you infinite damage scaling thanks to the armor strip. Other focus schools that work well are Moderai for the 50% casting speed and the Phoenix Talons passive, or Zeneric if you find yourself struggling to sustain. Last but not least is a Panzer build with just the synth mods equipped. Now moving on to the rankings, we're discussing Zephyr in relation to 4 separate topics. Firstly, her KPM, secondly, her survivability, thirdly, her viability, and finally, how fun she is to play. All of this data sampled from a 1-hour solo Steel Path Mock run with no Spectres, no on-call, and of course, no Archon shards. Now let's begin with the first topic, Zephyr's KPM. Now, Zephyr, like Vauban, has the potential to reach incredibly high KPM thanks to her playstyle being a group and nuke playstyle through the use of Air Burst, grouping the enemies together, and her fourth ability allowing you to shoot into all of the enemies, even with single target weapons, which redirects all of that damage into every single enemy individually, and Tornadoes doubles your final crit damage, making you just do absurd levels of damage. On top of this, since they are all stacked on top of each other, you can make use of electricity to chain electricity procs between every single enemy, again making you do even more absurd damage. Not only that, but since she doesn't really require too much in the mod department, you can freely run Unero on her without really sacrificing anything for access to an armor strip allowing you to have infinite damage scaling with electricity. Another problem that other succ frames have is whenever you go to suck at enemies, they get stuck behind walls and you can no longer kill them. This is still kind of an issue on Zephyr, but Zephyr has it the best out of all of them, as Airburst does not have line of sight checks, and Airburst does an excellent job at pulling enemies out and around from walls into the open into your tornadoes. Even in the rare circumstances that it doesn't, your fourth ability Tornado can still hit enemies through walls on occasion, making it not really that big of a deal. She still has KPM swings depending on how many LOS checks are around the room, but even in Zephyr's worst case scenarios, you can still realistically get 100 to 110 KPM with ease, again, even in her worst case scenarios. In her best case scenarios, she again caps out like most other suck frames around 140 to 150, which of course is very high. The main difference is Zephyr is more, she's more stable, her KPM is more consistent, and she has a lot higher scaling thanks to all of her buffs. I will give her an S rank for her KPM. It is really, really good. Now, moving on to her survivability, and her survivability is also insane. Her third ability, Turbulence, makes you outright immune to almost all ranged projectiles in the game. The only things that can damage you are melee enemies like Butchers, and Xmas abilities like Arson Xmas or Shock Xmas. Some other things that ignore it are occasionally the beam MOAs, the MOAs that shoot out lasers, can occasionally hit you, and also Vor. When Vor spawns in the Void, he summons a bunch of laser turrets and they can also shoot you. These are the only threats that can kill you as Zephyr. Without being rude, if you die to something that isn't a melee hit or a Shock Xmas as Zephyr, it is entirely your fault, and her survivability is insane. Even with Shock Xmas ignoring her Turbulence, which that is a way to die, like that is a realistic way to die on Zephyr, you do have enough time with Rolling Guard to proc Rolling Guard, get the 3 seconds of invincibility, go into Unero, armor strip them, and then kill them even up to level cap before they can kill you whenever your Overguard runs out. Sorry, not your Overguard. Before your Rolling Guard runs out. So again, even the only things that can kill you as Zephyr, You have the counterplay option of just pressing rolling guard, armor stripping with the Unero, and then dealing with the threat, taking them out the game. So even though she does have very few issues with survivability, they are few and far between, and there is enough counterplay to where you realistically, as long as you're paying attention, should almost never ever die as Zephyr. I am giving her an S rank for her survivability. Her survivability being really high is also nice for her KPM, as it allows the use of Magus Anomaly to pull in enemies that are out of range of your airburst, as airburst, even with 280% range, only has like a 22.4 meter range, and Magus Anomaly has a 30 meter range. Most other Warframes can make use of Magus Anomaly for grouping as well, but Zephyr having infinite survivability makes it that much better, as you are very vulnerable. Spam going in and out of operators. What can happen is you can go into your operator just as your shield breaks, and by the time that you leave your operator, your shield gain immunity is gone, and then you instantly die. With Zephyr, this is a non-factor, which this helps buff her survivability and her KPM both up. Now, moving on to the third topic, her viability, and her viability is also really good. In everyday missions, she's not the best, but she's decent because she has a grouping tool with airburst, and in low-level missions, you can run a bunch of damage mods like Vigorous Swap, Holster Amp, High Strength, High Range, and use Nourish, as Nourish buffs the damage from your airburst, and you can nuke like level 60 and below missions by just running around spamming airburst. It's kind of funny. And even ignoring that, if you run Zephyr's augment to disable her passive, you can freely run through missions just as quick as other Warframes. And like I mentioned earlier, she's not confined by needing like every single stat in the game, so you have enough open mod slots on Zephyr to where you can realistically run movement mods on your main build, even in endurance runs, and it's not that big of a deal. Like if somebody linked me a Zephyr build where they're running Rush and they're just using it 24/7 no matter what they're doing for 30% sprint speed, or they're running something like Mobilize for the bullet jump velocity or the Firewalker, etc., those mods that give a bunch of bullet jump velocity, I really wouldn't sit there and be like, that build's bad. Because Zephyr is I think she's the only frame in the game where you can realistically sacrifice mods for those utility mods and it doesn't negatively impact her at all. Like, it doesn't impact her at all just because she's so strong. So even in those normal missions, you can run a build with just a bunch of movement mods and you're completely fine. You can even forget to change your build, go into endurance run, and again, you're just completely fine. Then you have excavation missions. Zephyr, in my opinion, is the best frame for excavations. The only frame that might be better is Frost, in my opinion. But Zephyr is insane because, again, her turbulence is an AoE around her, meaning if you just sit on top of the excavator won't die to anything, again, other than melees or Blitz Eximus, which nothing in the game protects the excavator from a Blitz Eximus. So it's just good. Not only that, you can still do normal Zephyr gameplay of summoning your tornadoes, grouping enemies in, and killing them to maintain high KPM for resources, void traces, or just, general power cells. Also for survival, in my opinion, she is tied with two other Warframes for being the absolute best survival frame in the game. I think Zephyr, Octavia, and Protea are the three best survival frames. You know what? Zaku's also up there, so I guess Zephyr's tied with three other frames for being the absolute best survival frame. So she's really good there. She's good in defense, as she can suck enemies in, and she can also protect the defense similar to Excavator. And again, she's like above average in normal missions. Even in Disruption, she's not terrible. As in Disruption, you can always make use of the 150% crit chance from her passive. And then, of course, you're invincible thanks to Turbulence, so you don't have to worry about randomly dying while dealing with the Demolist. So all in all, she's extremely viable. I will give her an S- rank for her viability, and keep in mind, viability is by far the hardest stat to get a high rank in. Now moving on to the final topic of, is Zephyr fun? And for what she is, I actually do think she is decently fun. The only complaint I have with Zephyr is that you cannot invert her fourth ability, Tornado, to be tap cast for the tornadoes to stand still, so you always have to hold your 4 for the tornadoes to stand still, and that is legitimately my only complaint with Zephyr. And with most frames, I can find a few things to nitpick and say I don't like, but with Zephyr, I really can. On top of all that, she does have build variety in that you can play her first. You can play with her first ability to do the target fixation build, which theoretically has infinite damage scaling. You can run her standard build with Tornado plus Air Burst, or you can run the fun meme build with Vigorous Swap, Holster Amp, Nourish, and Air Burst for nuking low-level missions. So, and not only that, she can also run a bunch of different weapon loadouts, so she has build variety, weapon variety, all of that makes her slightly more fun, and she doesn't have many frustrations, especially like a lot of other suck frames where you have to like sit there and find the perfect room for them to work. With Zephyr, of course you still have to find a room, but it's not nearly as bad as with most other suck frames, as her 2 does an excellent job at pulling enemies around walls, which I think no other suck ability really does. And you're also not sitting there cycling through a million different buffs, upkeeping a million different abilities like you are with someone such as Vauban. And you also don't have to worry about staying alive. Like, you still have to pay attention to keep yourself alive, but it's not a constant struggle of keeping yourself alive. So that's a benefit. So, all in all, for what she is, I do think she's decently fun compared to most other suck frames. I will give her a B+ rank for her fun. In conclusion, Zephyr is an S- tier Warframe who in my opinion is the best of her class of being a suck and nuke frame. The only downside that she has is that her second ability, Airburst, doesn't have as big of a range as most other grouping tools, but she makes up for this by Airburst having better sucking capabilities of pulling enemies around walls, and also having high enough survivability to where you can make full use of Magus Anomaly without worrying about dying.
Actually, I am like starting to get like a really good Ember build, honestly.
You're
Yeah,
an
I don't think
Ember build?
Thank you.
I think I'm bugged.
Click to you.
I'm right here.
Okay. Oh god. Gentlemen, we have an anomaly. My man here is actually moving at 50% movement speed.
Just let him die, I guess. Wait,
My
he got
death
teleported across the
animation.
map.
My death animation was at 50% speed too.
At least you're not bleeding out at 50% speed. Wait.
I mean, that would be a good thing though.
No, he is.
You are.
Wait,
Oh my god.
Oh god, you revive him at half speed!
Wait, really?
Oh god, that feels really slow.
Oh, I think that's normal.
Okay, I felt like, okay. I felt like I was reviving at half speed there. I was like, wait.
How do you bleed out at half speed?
I mean, how do you bleed?
Oh my god.
I hate how I said that jokingly.
Is he coming back? Alright.
I'm back at normal speed.
Oh fuck.
Save the game.
Oh god, I actually have to fucking stop for a second.